Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thanks for coming to my session. Been a really interesting day. I have to admit, a lot of it went right over my head, but some brilliant speakers and content here today. And hopefully what I have to say today will be of interest and get you thinking a little bit differently. So my name is Molly. I am an accessibility and usability consultant in the design team at Nexa Digital. We are a human-centered design, development and research agency based up in the north of the UK. But we're part of a bigger Swedish company called Nexa Group, whereas we're the Nexa Digital team. But within Nexa Digital, we have an accessibility team, which really feeds into everything we are passionate about. We are passionate about that human-centered, inclusive approach, basically battling barriers in society and all things digital. We come from a varied background, so mine's more in design. Danny, the accessibility lead, he's from a testing background. Emma's more from a development background, and Alina from the more films and so on, which really feeds into a nice inclusive approach again in everything we do, because we bring different thoughts to the table, which is great. So, on to the content. So thinking about inclusion. So what is digital accessibility? Digital accessibility is very similar to physical accessibility, but people are often disabled by inaccessible services and products. Accessibility is about finding and dismantling barriers, and this is not just nice to have, it is about having access to essential services and fully participating in society. But this doesn't just narrow it down to people with disabilities. There's people from all backgrounds and so on with access needs, our ageing population as well. But let's talk numbers, actually. It's often a good place to start. So in the UK, we have around 16 million people that are living with a disability. That's around 24%. Interestingly, I've been doing like this slide deck and similar for a long time, and this figure has just gone up and up and up, particularly since COVID. Not sure really why that is. A lot of thought-provoking stuff from Holly's presentation earlier. She talked a lot about the social media side and how people are coming forward and getting diagnosed because they are hearing more experiences and thinking that's me and so on. So that's quite an interesting movement, shall we say, when it comes to figures. But also, it's actually, ironically, a very inaccessible system to receive a diagnosis of a disability. So I know many people that go years and years without a diagnosis that are living with an impairment or disability, and so therefore are further excluded because they don't have the diagnosis to then receive the support and tools they actually need. So when we think about accessibility and inclusive design, these figures that I'm showing you are even higher when we think about designing and who we are designing and developing for. But already pretty high figures, so 24% in the UK. Across Europe, we've got some varying figures actually, but again, some pretty big figures. And they vary for lots of different reasons, environmentally, culturally, but these numbers, again, arguably even higher. So, leads us to worldwide 1.3 billion people. So that's 1 in 6. A lot of people living with a long-term disability. Majority of these people that are diagnosed are often, they've acquired disabilities over time. So again, this can just grow and grow and grow as we all age. We can start acquiring something at any point. Around 83% will acquire an access need during our working lives. So again, when we think about these numbers, valid enough, but it's even bigger when we think about the bigger picture. So being disabled and having an impairment are not exactly the same. Disability occurs when barriers exist between people and the environments are often created by people. So this can happen to anyone in different situations. For example, if you are traveling somewhere and cannot speak the language to communicate, you would essentially experience a disability or an inaccessibility. However, having a digital translator or a person to translate would remove that barrier. So we create environments that people interact with, and then we become responsible for either disabling or enabling people. Barriers can be physical or caused by people's attitudes to difference as well, and barriers are removed. People with disabilities can be independent and equal. This concept is known as the social model, and I'll talk a little bit more about this from my own experience in a moment. There was a really great documentary, if you were interested, that's streaming on Netflix called Is There Anybody Out There? And it's done by a filmmaker, by a disabled lady. And she talks about the ableism that exists in today's society that end up disabling her more than her actual impairment. So it's really all about the attitudes in society that ironically are more inaccessible and ableist, and so therefore we do not receive the same experience as everybody else. A lot of people, I heard questions in the audience earlier again with Holly's talk, with sort of legality things, but it's also a business case to design for accessibility. It can be a really good thing for business. There's a thing called the Purple Pound, which equates to about 274 billion per year. And the Purple Pound basically illustrates disabled people in the UK and their families and what they contribute and what they're paying towards and so on. So if you're excluding them, you're not just excluding them, but their families and so on. I think it's around 1 in 6 households in the UK have a disabled person. So it's a lot. It's so much more than just it's the right thing to do. So there are accessibility standards out there. You may or may not have heard of some of these, but there's one that's been around for a while, the Equality Act in 2010. We have the European Accessibility Objective 2018. And then we have the more recent up-and-coming one for 2025, which is really interesting because it actually enforces companies to think about accessibility, and not just in the public, but also private sector. And that's not just, on websites, but beyond ATMs and so on. They all refer to the W3C, and I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but they're basically a bunch of resources that are really helpful for people that want to understand and learn more about the legality side of things and things to refer to when you're trying to fight the case for accessibility. Can anybody tell me, if you just shout, who here has heard of WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? Wow. Okay, amazing, that's okay. You've heard of it now. So WCAG is a bunch of guidelines when thinking about digital accessibility, and it's divided into 4 categories and also referred to as POUR. So P for perceive, so can people perceive it? Operable, can people operate? Understandable, can people understand? So the content you're putting on your websites. And robust, can everybody get to it? So really thinking about the tools and the user in the journey. And underneath each of them are a bunch of guidelines that can help you enable that further accessibility in the experience. Sounds great, and I know a lot of people in the industry love a good checklist, but I will touch back on this in a moment. But yes. Our team at Nexa, we have a wide range of access needs. So people maybe don't identify as having a disability or an impairment, but they have an access need. They're not all related, Our last report, I think a consensus, it was 21% of Nexa Digital reported identifying as having a disability. Now, I am one of these people. You may have noticed a dog, might be the main reason you're in this room today. wouldn't blame you. But I kind of fell into the world of accessibility, very passionate about it due to my own experiences. And they say that those who had been excluded they know the best way to be more included, if that makes sense. So I was born deaf, and I was given my first pair of hearing aids at 18 months old. So that was my first introduction to technology, the world of accessibility. My parents wanted me to be able to communicate orally, so I had speech therapy from the get-go at 18 months, and I wasn't able to speak until I was about 6 years old. Very glad we went down this route because it is more inclusive. I can quite literally use my voice to speak up and ask for help, but more so with what was to follow. I turned around 12 years old, and I started senior school, and I started struggling to lip read, and I was clumsier, and I was struggling with headaches. And it was my teacher of the deaf at the time who said, "Molly, you might need reading glasses." It's not unusual for deaf people to experience such exhaustion through the eyes, because the saying goes, deaf people hear with their eyes is so true, whether it's sign language, lip patterns, gestures, facial expressions, and so on. I was a lip reader. So as soon as that started to fail, I was feeling particularly excluded and isolated. So we went to an optician thinking I might need some reading glasses to just ease that. And the optician at the time said to my parents, "Do you know why Molly is deaf?" And they said, "Well, we think it's, we were told it was a technical blip. We don't have any family history," and that was that. When he had a look at the back of my eyes, he then said, "I think there's something not quite right at the back of Molly's eyes, and I think it's linked to her deafness." So I was then diagnosed with a new condition called Usher Syndrome, which I was actually born with. So it's actually the most common cause of congenital deaf blindness. So it starts off with deafness, and then the onset of a progressive blindness called retinitis pigmentosa comes on during your adolescence years. So that's what I was starting to experience when I was struggling to lip read and read the board at school. The retinitis pigmentosa of it on its own is actually quite a common progressive condition. And what it is, you can be born sighted, and then you lose your peripheral vision, night blindness, glare blindness as well. But the rate of progression and how much the person loses depends on the person. I went from being partially sighted at the age of 12 to severely sight impaired, politically correct for blind at the age of 14. So I'm now 29, 30 this year, and I have a useful 5 degrees vision left. Explains the guide dog. One of the things with Usher is that I've come to learn that society do still have a lot of misconceptions around sensory disabilities and impairments in general. Certainly when people clock that I am deaf and I can communicate the way I do, and when I'm blind but I look at them when I'm communicating with them, there's still a lot of misconceptions around disabilities. You may or may not have gone to a workshop or come across something or seen something online where they have handed out some simulation goggles to try and emulate the experience of people with different eye conditions. Now, they are useful to an extent to understand some of the experiences that to understand some of the challenges that people can be having. But it's important to understand that any sort of emulation tool, simulation tool, are not 100% accurate, but they are helpful to an extent to understand some challenges that could be had. So with that in mind, I wanted to draw my own interpretation of what I see. So this is Bella, running through a field, having the time of her life. And then I've drawn like an overlay. So I mentioned a minute ago the loss of peripheral vision. So there's no useful vision around the edges, and I have my useful 5 degrees in the middle. People say to me, you know, around the edges where you've lost your peripherals, is it just black? Well, no, it's just non-useful vision. It's like a heavy fog with flashing lights and white spots and squiggles and floaters and all sorts. And the middle bit, that's my useful vision, can be a bit bigger or smaller depending on the light. So I have a lot of very damaged light receptors that are very sensitive. 93% of the blind community have some useful vision. They may not use it or find it too helpful, But the remaining 7% have no useful vision, so they might see light and dark. So when we think about designing and developing tools for better accessibility, people instantly assume that a blind person uses a screen reader. And often when I say I am registered blind and do not use a screen reader, people are immediately shocked. And often a website can work really well with a screen reader, but I'm still excluded because they haven't anticipated blind people having vision and using other tools other than a screen reader. So again, it's that the lack of understanding of the community. So hopefully, excuse the pun, it's opened your eyes to how some people can see with retinitis pigmentosa. This is a condition that is progressive, so I could lose the rest. There's no way of knowing. So one of the reasons why I talk about my experience, and certainly because accessibility is something that's so close to heart, is because I've obviously experienced a lot of exclusion. I feel very grateful that I live in a time where technology exists and it's evolved over time, and it's amazing. However, as it's evolved, more barriers have appeared because of all of the design processes and development processes where they haven't considered the complexities when it comes to the actual user experience of people with disabilities. And I think the two main barriers, or the two main things that lets them down, is not understanding that people can A, acquire a disability, and B, be born with a disability. These will determine the main difference within the community. To break that down, so I have 5 degrees useful vision. If you put me next to someone who was born with 5 degrees useful vision, you can guarantee that me and this person would not mobilize the same way or interact with our devices the same way. And actually the person being born blind would probably be a whiz at screen reader technology, probably reads Braille, and so on. Whereas for me, because I was born sighted, I'm still ironically a very sighted person, albeit I don't have a lot of vision left. I still use a lot of magnification and color filters and zoom and so on. So the way we use things is very different. It might have the same visual level, but the tools and how we get from A to B will be very, very different. And it's the same with being deaf. So a lot of people assume that because I am deaf, I must know sign language, when actually, realistically speaking, a very small portion of the deaf community depend on sign language. The majority of deaf and people with hearing loss globally actually acquire it rather than are born with it. And the thing with sign language, it is a choice that's made at the very beginning by the families, and it is a cultural choice as well with sign language. I did learn sign language later on to communicate with the community, but it is something that I have never depended on, yet I always get asked, do you know sign language? Because it's just that stereotype that every deaf person uses sign language. But any one of us can have challenges. There are so many invisible disabilities out there that maybe because of society, people feel they don't want to tell you or disclose it in employment and so on, because you do hear the stories, people getting made redundant or getting sacked because they've disclosed a disability. It happens. But what amazes me when we think about accessibility and who we're actually benefiting, because it's a lot of us in the room, is wearing a pair of glasses, for instance, is a form of assistive technology, so therefore you have got access needs. By the age of 40, 45, most of us will need glasses. And glasses are there, they help you read or drive or see better in the dark, I don't know. Yet so many websites and apps are not compatible with the resizing of text. And I find that really bizarre. My parents, one's 59, one's 60, they have their text size set on their iPhones, larger than I have mine, and I'm registered blind. And that's just because they're a bit older, and that's happening to us all. But it says, in iOS settings, when you adjust your large text size, the apps that support dynamic type should adjust to your preferred reading size above. It very rarely happens. And I find that really bizarre when you think how many people would actually benefit from large text. I mentioned right at the beginning, 83% of us will acquire an access need later on in life. So it doesn't necessarily, there's a lot of people that may have an access need, but they don't identify as having access needs because they've changed the way they look at things, like they might have changed their phone to dark mode. Anyone here use dark mode? Yeah, you got to shout at me, I'm deaf, guys, come on. Yes, lovely. And I have noticed this in the tech industry. A lot of us do love a bit of dark mode, but that started out as an accessibility tool because dark mode is more relaxing on the eye and it increases that contrast. And a lot of people with low vision do prefer the dark mode from an accessibility point of view, but a lot of them are now seen more as a preference and it's more mainstreamed. But they start off as an accessibility thing, but they're now more normalized. So when we think about impairments and disabilities, when we think about the user experience, working with our clients and stuff, there are various categories of types of impairments, but we don't sit down and we think about all the different types of disabilities out there. We couldn't do that, it's not physically possible. We think about the experience that users could be having. So divided into your hearing, your visual, sensory motor, voice with the days of Alexa and Siri and so on, cognitives often overlooked, but thankfully it's becoming more and more recognized for people with ADHD or dyslexia to be taking these things into account when designing and developing these things. And also mental health. Statistically speaking now, a lot of people with disabilities are twice as likely to have mental health issues like anxiety, so booking a flight and so on can create some kind of anxiety which then impacts your journey and what you are doing online, whether or not you complete a journey and so on. And also the flip side of it, if you have mental health issues, long term, it can actually mean that you're twice as likely to have an access need later on in life. But then we talk about our temporary or situational, various experiences I'm sure we've all experienced in this room. Something as simple as forgetting your glasses, hearing when you're in a noisy environment. We're not saying that by any means these experiences mean you know what it's like to have a permanent disability or impairment, but these are also valid experiences that everyone could be having whilst using their phone or whatever. Now, there are some really cool plug-in tools on Chrome that you can install to get to understand some of these experiences. There's one called SilkTide. But what's really important to understand, again, like what I said with the simulation goggles, is that they are there to show some of the challenges that people could be having, but they're not an accurate representation of what it's like to have dyslexia or what it's like to have cataracts and so on. But what's really cool with SilkTide that I will recommend is that you can overlap. So you can have more than one. So for instance, with me, I've actually got 3 different eye conditions. I'm also colorblind and I've got cataracts, and that can feed into the experience when it comes to color, contrast, and so on. So what is the best way to design for inclusion? I mentioned WCAG earlier, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Really great resource to know and to have at all times. However, the best examples of accessible services are made from people's needs and not checklists. Unfortunately, as easy as that would make life, people and society, none of it is black and white. So we have to encourage actual manual testing and include as many people with different needs in all of our processes. But I'm going to give you an example now of a company that just took the WCAG approach, which happens a lot. People just look at WCAG and they've gone, we've done this, tick, 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 we're fully accessible. Can anybody here tell me, and you'll have to shout at me, because remember I am deaf, what is wrong with this picture? What's that? Color? Yeah, almost. So just to, in case you're unable to access what's up there, it might be a bit blurry, but there's text and then there's Braille underneath, so the tactile reading format for blind people.
How is a blind person supposed to know which light is this?
Thank you. Now, it's one of those if you don't laugh, you cry situations, because it just gets worse. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So people think, and what they've done is they've looked at the guidelines and they've gone, right, we need to make sure all labels have Braille on it to be accessible for the entire blind community. First of all, they've assumed that every blind person uses Braille. But secondly, they haven't understood the user, because if that person is using Braille, they have no useful vision, they are not going to see, whether the door's locked or not. And I don't know about you, but traveling on a train and going to the toilet is the most nerve-wracking experience anyway, isn't it? Especially the ones that talk to you and the sliding doors and God only knows what. So if anything, I would more often avoid it and be in pain than use them. But yes, this experience happens all too often, unfortunately, because people look at the checklist and they think, tick, 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 done, moving on. But they've not actually understood the user in this situation. And it's not just Braille. Yeah. Not sure, obviously this could be, ramps are helpful for wheelchair users, but also prams. Would you love to push your little baby down one of these ramps? Not sure I would. So it's quite clearly, it's a couple of steps, and then they've gone, oh, we need to put a ramp in there. Let's just flatten it down the middle. Bob's your uncle. And it's actually created a danger zone instead of making it more inclusive. But of course, it's also digital. So showing you an example here with a site that we recently worked on. There are some automated tools called Wave, Axe, there's Wave Lighthouse, Site Improve. Again, all like Chrome plugin extensions that run like a little test on a site, and it tells you how accessible, non-accessible it is, and it does give you little pointers. Again, great, and it does refer to the WCAG guidelines. However, that you do run the danger by just relying on these things, and I'm going to show you why. So we're looking at a form here, just standard form, and we've run Wave, where it's just an automated tool that basically tells us what to look out for, what looks good and what isn't, but it's actually telling us that there's no errors on this page. Brilliant. So they would just move on and say, this works really well for someone using a screen reader, fully blind person could navigate this, no problem. However, when we, bear with me a second, yeah. So yeah, it says all the form fields and inputs are labeled, which is what we would be looking for, so it even highlights that in the tool. So again, people will be like, yeah, this is great, we're doing a great job. However, when we test it with a screen reader, it turns out that the labels are not at all helpful. So if you can imagine, you've got no useful vision, you're navigating through this form, and it is just saying, answer required, answer required, answer required. It's not saying first name, answer required, or last name, answer required. It's just saying answer required for every field. So obviously the automated tool has gotten, yes, doing a great job, you've got labels and everything, it works, it's accessible, but actually when the user uses it, it's not accessible. And that's because people have just gone down the checklist approach. They've not included actual users, and so therefore they've excluded more than they think they've included. So let's normalize inclusive design, because when we get it right, it becomes invisible. One of the very early on tools that we wouldn't even think twice about is volume. We adjust volume based on our environment and based on our access need. We can't hear it, so we'll higher it up, or, dad's sleeping on the couch, we lower it down, whatever. It is an assistive tool that we've been using for so long, we don't even view it as an assistive tool. Who here uses pinch zoom? I was going to say, if you said no, you're lying. Everyone does, right? I remember being a millennial when Instagram first came out. I could not access Instagram because I could not pinch zoom, and obviously it's a very image-focused app. You can now do that, which is great. What about video captions? Who uses video captions? Exactly. So initially, video captions were, something that was just for the deaf and hearing impaired community. However, this lady here is on a train where things would be really noisy, but she can still fully digest that content using the captions. There was an argument that was had in one of my talks a few years ago where someone said, well, Facebook enabled that more for marketing purposes than it being an accessibility thing. And I was like, well, whatever, it still made it accessible, I'm happy. So again, it's become more normalized. You see children now using captions, and it's really good for their reading and focus abilities as well. So accessibility should not ever be considered as an afterthought or as help, but as reasonable built-in adjustments for us all. And I hope that I've made some kind of sense. I apologize for my puffiness. I am pregnant, in case anyone wondered, a bit out of breath when I talk. But thank you very much. I am on LinkedIn if you want to scan the QR thing. And if you had any questions after today, please feel free to reach out. There are 4 minutes left though, so if anyone's got any questions now, I'll happily take some. But thank you very much for having me.
Do we have any questions from the audience whilst we've got a couple of minutes left?
Oh, gosh. Silence.
In that case, there is one session to go that I'll announce shortly, but I'm sure that you don't mind me saying that if you've got more questions afterwards, people can come and find you in the evening reception.
Yep.
So we're going to take a short break now, but before I do, one more round of applause, please.